Half of Europe was dead, and the first thing its governments did was make it illegal to ask for a raise. Not metaphorically, not as policy subtext, as written law, with named penalties, royal enforcement, and prison for anyone who broke it. At Cuxham in Oxfordshire, a ploughman who had earned 2 shillings a week before the plague was demanding 10 shillings by 1350, a 500% increase in a single year. While a law existed, passed in Parliament, specifically to stop him, he got it anyway. And here is the part that no history class ever explains. So did almost everyone else. Real wages in England nearly tripled between the early 1300s and the late 1400s. The Wolf Age. Economic inequality plummeted across France, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The share of wealth held by the richest 10% collapsed in ways that would not be seen again for 600 years. The rigid, ancient, God-ordained hierarchy of feudal Europe, the system that had told the people at the bottom that their position was permanent, natural, and divinely sanctioned, cracked open. Not because of a war, not because of a king, because enough people survived a plague and looked around at empty fields, ownerless livestock, and desperate lords who needed them more than they needed the lords, and made a simple, quiet, individual decision. I am worth more than this. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone in Europe. It also accidentally built the modern world, and the people who ran that world knew it was happening, tried to stop it with every tool they had: law, punishment, force, propaganda, and failed completely. This is the story they left out of the chapter. In 1351, the English Parliament passed a law. Not a law against murder, not a law against theft, not a law against anything most people would consider a crime. This law made it illegal to ask for a raise. Specifically, it made it illegal for a peasant, a carpenter, a blacksmith, any working man or woman in England, to demand wages higher than what they had earned before 1348. The penalty for breaking this law was imprisonment. The law was called the Statute of Labourers, and it was rushed through Parliament with a speed that was, for the 14th century, almost unprecedented. Within 3 years of its passage, royal courts across England had processed over 9,000 individual violations. 9,000 people prosecuted for the crime of earning more money. Think about that for a moment. Governments pass emergency legislation for emergencies: wars, invasions, famines, natural disasters. The English crown looked at its kingdom in the aftermath of the worst biological catastrophe in recorded human history, a plague that had just killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. And its first instinct was not to
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
rebuild. It was not to mourn. It was to make sure that the people who survived could not profit from surviving. We know this because the records are intact. The court rolls from 1352 to 1380 are held in the National Archives in London. They list names, occupations, villages, the exact wages that were demanded, the fines that were levied. Alice, Thomas, John, Margaret. Ordinary names, ordinary people, prosecuted by the state for being alive and knowing their own value. Here is what the textbooks never explain. If the Black Death was simply a tragedy, a natural disaster with no economic consequence beyond suffering, there would have been no reason for this law to exist. Laws are not passed to prevent things that are not happening. So why, in the middle of a mass death event, was the most powerful government in England's history so terrified of its own survivors? But when you actually look at the records, something does not add up. Here is the version of the Black Death that most of us learned. A disease arrived from the east. Carried by fleas on rats, it spread along trade routes from Central Asia, reached the port of Messina in Sicily in October 1347, and within 4 years had crossed every border in Europe. It killed indiscriminately. Kings and peasants, priests and merchants, the young and the old. Between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died. In some regions, entire villages were simply erased. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe without precedent. That is what the history books say. And on that point, they are not wrong. The plague is taught in schools as a chapter on suffering, a chapter on the fragility of medieval civilization. Teachers show students the illustrations, the skeletal figure of death dancing through crowded streets, the mass graves, the burning carts piled with bodies. The imagery is so powerful and so consistently repeated that it has become almost cinematic. We think we know what the Black Death was. A tragedy, a rupture, a before and after line drawn in blood across European history. And then, silence. The chapter ends. The next chapter begins, usually with the Renaissance, as if one followed neatly from the other, as if the continent simply dusted itself off and got back to work. What that version of events never asks is a very simple question. Who survived? Not in the abstract, not as a statistic. Who, specifically, woke up in the spring of 1349 in a village in Norfolk, or Burgundy, or Castile, looked around at the empty houses, the untended fields, the livestock wandering without owners, and realized that everything had changed? The answer, almost universally, was the people at the bottom. The nobility lived in relative isolation. The clergy had stone walls and distance. The merchant class had resources and mobility. But the peasants, the serfs, the tenant farmers, the laborers who worked land they did not own for lords they could not leave. They lived in the densest, most contaminated conditions. They should have been the most devastated, and many were. But the ones who survived found themselves in a world that had been, almost accidentally, restructured in their favor. For the first time in 5 centuries of feudal order, there were more fields than farmers to work them, more livestock than hands to tend it, more grain rotting in noble storehouses than carts available to move it. Lords needed workers, and for the first time in living memory, for the first time in anyone's memory, the workers had a choice. Not legally, not officially, but in practice, in the mud and the morning cold of a post-plague English village, a laborer could simply walk to the next manor and ask for more. And the lord there, desperate for hands, would pay it. Not out of generosity, out of necessity. This was not a revolution anyone planned. There were no pamphlets, no manifestos, no leaders. It was quieter than that. It was a carpenter in Kent, asking for 3 pennies instead of 2. A ploughman in Yorkshire, refusing to renew his contract at the old rate. A woman in Lincolnshire, her name recorded as Alice Pike in the court rolls of 1364, leaving her village and hiring herself out to a stranger 4 miles away for wages her own lord refused to match. She was prosecuted for it, of course, but she had done it, and so had thousands of others. The feudal system had survived invasions, famines, civil wars, and crusades. It had survived for 500 years on one foundational principle: that the people who worked the land had no alternative, that the bottom of the hierarchy stayed at the bottom because it had nowhere else to go. The Black Death gave them somewhere else to go, and the people at the top of that hierarchy saw it happening in real time. They watched the old order beginning to loosen, felt the ground shift beneath 5 centuries of certainty. And they did what powerful people have always done when the rules stop working in their favor. They rewrote the rules. Everything in that story is technically true, but technically true is not the same as honest. Here is the detail that the official story quietly skips. The statute of laborers did not work. Not partially. Not in some regions. It failed comprehensively, repeatedly, and in ways that the people who wrote it could see happening in real time. 1/3 of all parliaments held between 1351 and 1400, across 5 decades, spent time debating the labor laws. The communist. Think about what that means. If the law had worked, there would have been nothing left to debate. You do not keep emergency legislation on the parliamentary agenda for 50 years unless the emergency refuses to end. But here is where it gets interesting. The crack in the story is not that the law failed. Laws fail. That is not unusual. The crack is why it failed, and what that failure reveals about who actually held power in 14th century England. At the estate of Cuxham in Oxfordshire, a ploughman's weekly wages jumped from 2 shillings before the plague to 10 shillings by 1350. CU Denver College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. That is a 500% increase in a single year, while a law existed specifically to prevent it. And the man paying those wages was not a rebel. He was not a radical. He was a lord. A landowning member of the exact class the statute was designed to protect. What happened next was not an accident. Lords at estates across England began circumventing the wage caps by supplementing cash payments with in-kind benefits, extra food, drink, grain stipends, arrangements that were rarely prosecuted. CU Denver College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The law said you could not pay more, so they paid the legal amount and then quietly handed over a sack of grain, a side of pork, a jug of ale. Everyone understood what was happening. The justices understood. The sheriffs understood. And in many cases, the justices were the lords, drawn from the same landowning class whose interests the law supposedly served. Court records show that enforcement was heavily biased. Justices prioritized convictions for laborers demanding higher wages or moving between villages, while showing consistent leniency toward masters who were quietly breaking the same law from the other side. CU Denver College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. The system was eating itself. And then there is the detail that stops you cold. When the Crown needed a carpenter in Knightsbridge to build the stocks, the very instrument used to publicly punish workers who demanded above-rate wages, even that carpenter had to be paid over the odds to do the job. Medievalists. Read that again. The government could not enforce its own wage law without breaking its own wage law. The tool of punishment had to be built by a man who was paid exactly what the law said no one was allowed to be paid. The irony is almost too obvious. Almost. This is not a footnote. This is the entire argument in one image. The English crown, with the full weight of Parliament and royal justice behind it, could not suppress the economic reality that a catastrophic labor shortage had created. The market, if you want to call it that, in the mud and frost of a medieval English village, was simply stronger than the law. Despite every effort to hold the line, workers
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
continued to command higher wages, and the majority of England's laboring class enjoyed a full century of relative prosperity before the ratio of labor to land restored pre-plague conditions. A century. 100 years of higher wages, greater mobility, and accumulated leverage. All technically illegal. All happening anyway. But here is the question the records raise and never answer directly. If the law was failing this visibly, this consistently, for this long, why did the Crown keep passing it? Why revise it in 1388? Why reissue it again and again through the 15th century, each version more detailed and more desperate than the last? Because the law was never really about wages. It was about something much older and much more fragile. 3 pieces of evidence. Each one alone is interesting. Together, they are impossible to ignore. The law was not about wages. It never was. Here is the first piece of evidence. When the Statute of Laborers was drafted in 1351, its authors included a clause that had nothing to do with money. It prohibited workers from leaving their villages, not just from demanding higher pay, from physically moving, from walking to the next town and offering their labor elsewhere. A peasant who abandoned his lord's land without permission could be arrested, branded, and returned by force. This was not a wage law. It was a containment law. We know this because of a single document, one that almost nobody read. The original preamble of the statute, preserved in the parliamentary rolls, states its reasoning with startling clarity. It describes workers who, recognizing the scarcity of their labor after the plague, were demanding wages and conditions that the lords considered, and this is the exact word used, excessive. The Crown's concern was not economic stability. It was not inflation. It was something older and more primal. It was the fear of a class discovering its own value. Parliament passed laws to hold down wages while simultaneously encouraging landlords to reassert their ancient manorial rights. CU Denver College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, rights that predated the plague, predated the statute, predated living memory. The combination of these 2 pressures, frozen wages and renewed demands for feudal service, was a vice, tightening from both sides, deliberately. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it. Here is the second piece. For 30 years the vice held, imperfectly, corruptly, with constant leakage around the edges, but it held. And then, in 1380, the Crown made a decision that broke everything. It imposed a new poll tax. Not the first, not even the second. The people had previously been taxed 27 times during the reign of Edward III alone. Taxes raised to fund wars in France, wars in Scotland, wars that had nothing to do with a peasant in Kent who had survived the plague and simply wanted to be paid what his labor was worth. The 1380 poll tax was different. It demanded the same flat rate from every adult in England, regardless of wealth. A duke paid the same as a ditch digger. And this is where it gets interesting. In June 1381, the countryside of Essex and Kent erupted. Rebels burned court records and opened local prisons as they marched, and the burning of records was not random violence. It was surgical. Those records contained the proof of who owed what feudal service to whom. Destroy the documents, and you destroy the legal architecture of serfdom itself. These were not desperate, starving men. The ringleaders were better off small farmers, people who had something to lose. People who had spent 30 years accumulating, quietly and illegally, the wages the statute had tried to deny them. People who now had enough standing to be outraged by a system that still treated them as property. Wat Tyler led his growing army toward London, capturing the towns of Maidstone, Rochester, and Canterbury along the way. CU Denver College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. When the 14-year-old King Richard II finally met the rebels at Mile End, he did not meet a rabble. He met an organized political force with a written list of demands. One of those demands was the total abolition of serfdom. Not better wages, not lower taxes, the complete dismantling of the system itself. And here is the third piece. the one that changes the picture entirely. The revolt failed. Richard II did not, or could not, keep any of his promises. He claimed that concessions made under threat were not valid in law. The remaining rebels were dealt with by force. Medievalists Wat Tyler was killed at Smithfield. John Ball, the radical priest who had preached that no man was born a lord, was captured, hanged, and dismembered. The letters abolishing serfdom were cancelled. The poll tax was withdrawn, that much the crown conceded, but everything else was revoked. On paper, the crown won. Every history book says so. But here is what the books say next, in the same breath, almost as a footnote. The institution of serfdom declined after 1381, primarily for economic rather than political reasons. Rural wages continued to increase. Lords increasingly sold their serfs' freedom in exchange for cash. During the 15th century, serfdom vanished in England entirely. Vanished. Not reformed, not reduced. Vanished. The revolt that officially failed, that was militarily crushed, whose leaders were executed, whose charter was burned, somehow produced every outcome it demanded, within 1 century of its defeat. This single decision changed everything that followed. The crown had won the battle so completely that it felt no need to address the underlying cause. And so the underlying cause kept operating, quietly, in the mud and the morning cold of 10,000 English villages. In wages paid above the legal rate. In serfs who purchased their freedom with money the statute said they were never supposed to earn. The most successful revolution in English history was one that everyone agreed had failed. This is not just a story about the past. It is a blueprint, and it is still being used. In 2021, more than 47 million Americans quit their jobs. Not fired, not laid off. They chose to leave. Workers took advantage of the labor shortage to trade their current jobs for those with higher salaries, more benefits, and better schedules. Brainly. The phenomenon was called the Great Resignation. Economists struggled to explain it. Psychologists were brought in. Senate committees held hearings. Business journals ran cover stories asking, in tones of genuine bewilderment, where did all the workers go? The answer was 670 years old. A pandemic had occurred nearly 700 years ago that illustrated this point precisely. The Black Death wiped out nearly half of Europe's population, causing a severe labor shortage, and the peasants who survived could suddenly bargain for better conditions or easily leave and find better situations elsewhere. Academia.edu. The geometry was identical. A mass death event disrupts the ratio of labor to demand. The people who survive discover their own scarcity. They begin to move. They begin to ask for more. And the people above them in the hierarchy, the lords, the shareholders, the executives, the parliaments, look at what is happening and reach instinctively for the same tool that Edward III reached for in 1351: control. After the Black Death, employers didn't simply succumb to laborers' demands. They also responded by turning to methods that increased productivity or efficiency, so they could get more done with less. The Wolf Age. In the 14th century, that meant switching from labor-intensive grain farming to sheep herding, which required fewer hands. In the 21st century, it means automation, artificial intelligence, self-checkout machines, delivery robots. The language is different. The logic is identical. The numbers do not lie. The interpretation does. Here is what the official story of the Black Death costs us by stopping too early. We have spent centuries treating the plague as a closed chapter, a catastrophe with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We learn about the death toll. We learn about the flagellants whipping themselves in the streets. We learn about the Pope, who sat between two fires to avoid contaminated air. And then the chapter closes and the Renaissance begins, as if civilization simply recovered and moved on. What that framing conceals is a pattern, a mechanism, a repeatable sequence of events that has played out with remarkable consistency after every major disruption to the labor supply in recorded history. The 1918 flu was followed by a burst of labor militancy. Coal miners, steel workers, railroad men, dressmakers demanding shorter hours, higher wages, safer conditions, and an end to the exploitation of women workers. Fast forward 100 years to COVID-19, and the same sequence reappeared. Academia.edu. Every time. Without exception. And every time the same counter-response appears with equal consistency. The powerful move to contain it. Sometimes with laws, sometimes with inflation, sometimes with the deliberate engineering of unemployment, raising interest rates until enough people are desperate enough to accept whatever is offered. Economists have noted that workers' ability to lock in higher wages long-term is minimal. As one senior economist put it bluntly, this moment is very short. The Wolf Age. That sentence could have been written by a justice of the peace in 1352, explaining to a frightened lord why the statute of laborers would eventually work, if they were patient enough. The Black Death did not just kill people. It revealed a structural truth that those in power have spent 7 centuries trying to bury. That the entire architecture of economic hierarchy depends, at its foundation, on workers not knowing what they are worth. The moment they find out, the whole structure trembles. The plague taught them. Every pandemic since has tried to teach them again. Nobody questioned this. For over 100 years, nobody questioned this. The question is not why the workers of 1349 rose up when they had the chance. The question is why we keep being surprised 6 centuries later when it happens again. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming very loudly. There is a question that the history of the Black Death forces you to sit with. Not a comfortable question. Not one with a clean answer. If the most transformative labor revolution in European history was never officially declared, if it happened in the margins, in the mud, in court records filed under the names of people no one remembers, then how many other revolutions have happened exactly the same way? Not in parliaments, not in manifestos, not in the dramatic moments that get written into textbooks and turned into films, but quietly, incrementally, in 10,000 small decisions made by people who had no platform, no title, and no guarantee that what they were doing would ever amount to anything. Alice Pick, prosecuted in Lincolnshire in 1364 for leaving her village to find better wages, did not know she was part of a revolution. She was not making a political statement. She was making a practical decision. She needed more. She went and found it. And the system that tried to stop her, the most powerful legal apparatus in medieval England, failed. Not because of any single act of defiance, but because enough people made the same practical decision, in enough places, often enough, that the structure could not hold. Serfdom did not end because a king signed a document. It ended because it became incrementally unenforceable. On the surface, it makes sense, but surfaces are rarely the whole story. This is the part of history that the official version consistently erases. Not out of malice necessarily, but because the official version needs protagonists. It needs a moment. It needs a date you can memorize and a name you can put on a monument. The slow, anonymous, structurally inevitable dismantling of a 500-year-old system of human bondage does not fit that format. So it gets filed under economics, under demographics, under the cold, bloodless language of labor supply and market correction. And the people who actually did it, the Alices, the Thomases, The carpenters who asked for 3 pennies instead of 2 and quietly won get filed under court records that almost nobody reads. What the Black Death actually left behind was not just a changed economy. It left behind proof of something that power has always understood and history has always underplayed. That the people at the bottom of any hierarchy are not powerless. They are foundational. And when enough of them move at the same time, even without coordination, even without leadership, even without a revolution anyone planned, the foundation shifts, and everything built on top of it has to shift with it, or collapse. The Black Death was not just a plague. It was the moment that Europe's laboring majority discovered, by accident, what it had always been worth. And no law, no matter how many times it was rewritten, could make them forget. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. If history buried that story for 600 years, told you the revolt failed, closed the chapter, moved on to the Renaissance, the question worth sitting with is this: what else is it still getting wrong? And who benefits from that version being the one we all believe? Tell me in the comments. I want to know which piece of this changed something for you. Next week, we uncover the man who history handed a crown of genius, and the trail of stolen inventions, silenced rivals, and deliberate erasures he left behind to keep it. The Black Death killed half a continent, but the survivors, nameless, landless, legally powerless, built the world you are living in right now. They just never got a chapter. The real lesson of the Black Death is not about plague. It is about us.